everyone, Diane here. Today, we are going to be using our wonderful brains to sort some different quadrilaterals. Before we jump in, let's talk about what is a quadrilateral. When we are looking at the word, there are two things I notice. The first is quad, and I know that that means four. The next is lateral, and I know that means side. A quadrilateral is a four-sided figure. We are going to be looking at sides and angles to classify these different shapes. So before we jump in, let's talk about some different words that we will be using throughout this sort. Congruent, meaning equal. Parallel, meaning that they are never going to cross. Then we've got right angles, like an L, acute angles, smaller than a right angle, and obtuse angles, larger than right angles. So here are a bunch of four-sided figures. Let's take a look and see how we could sort them to figure out what some of them have in common. Go ahead and take a look. What do you notice about the different side lengths? Do you notice anything about the angles? I asked some of my students about this sort, and here's what they came up with. Does their sorting look similar to what you were thinking? What do you notice about these? Exactly. All of these have right angles, but some of the side lengths are different. With that, let's talk about the types of shapes that have only right angles. For now, we're going to focus on rectangles. So what makes a rectangle a rectangle? Tell someone around you what you know about rectangles, and tell me too. Yeah, definitely has four right angles, opposite sides are congruent, and opposite sides are parallel. So let's shift these into a group where all of these traits are included. I'm starting to see another trait that some of these quadrilaterals have. What do you notice about them? Would you whisper it to me? Exactly. These all look like they have four congruent sides. Even though they fulfill all the requirements of a rectangle, they also can be called a square. So all of these could be called a rectangle, but only some of them could be called a square. So now let's flip over to this group. I noticed that these do not have all four angles being right angles. Do you notice anything about the sides of some of them? What do you notice about these quadrilaterals? Very nice. Someone said some of these quadrilaterals have two sets of parallel lines and others have one set. I definitely noticed that too. Two sets of parallel lines would be a parallelogram. Do you see any other figures that have two sets of parallel lines? Isn't it cool that squares and rectangles meet the requirements of the parallelogram too? So now let's transition to talking about those shapes over here that have one set of parallel lines. Do you know what we would call those? Would you tell me? Yes, they could definitely be called a quadrilateral. Yes, exactly. These would be called a trapezoid. Trapezoids have exactly one set of parallel lines. It's funny though, the angles are so different on these and the others seem to be very similar. So thinking about that, would a square or a rectangle be able to be counted as a trapezoid as well? Would you whisper your thinking to me? No? But a square has been counted as everything so far. How could it not be a trapezoid? Those parallel lines, that's what did it? That's some really good noticing for you. All right, now let's talk about one more group that I have of these quadrilaterals. These seem fairly unique. I notice that all sides are congruent, and I also see that opposite angles are equal. These figures are called rhombuses. Do you notice any other shape that has the traits of a rhombus? So just a reminder, a rhombus has 4 equal sides and opposite angles are equal. Nice noticing. A square does have 4 equal sides and opposite angles are equal. How interesting is it that a square is included in a lot of these different categories of quadrilaterals? Did I almost say triangles? Whew. Here are some other quadrilaterals that I want you to try to sort in another way. Take a look while I start sorting and thinking. I notice that these all have right angles up here, kind of like in our other categories when we talked about squares and rectangles. So I'm going to keep those up there. Next, I really notice these. And if I turn them, one thing that I see is that they have 2 sets of parallel sides. Those would be called parallelograms. So if I put those together, notice they can go one way or another. It's pretty nice. You can be flexible with it. They could be vertical. Next, I saw this one. This is something that we see a lot. It's got 1 set of parallel sides. Do you remember what those are called? Exactly, trapezoids. But one thing that we didn't talk a lot about is this type of trapezoid right here that has a right angle. This would be called a right trapezoid. It still fulfills the requirement of 1 set of parallel sides, but it's a little fancy with this right angle here. Lastly, I've got this little guy, and looks almost like it would be a parallelogram. It could probably fit there. But the thing that I really noticed about it, mostly because it was situated vertically, is that it looks like the opposite angles are equal. That would be like the rhombus that we talked about. So I kind of had this dude chilling over here on the side because it looked just a little bit different that I didn't at first think that it would be a parallelogram. Now, what I want us to look at are these yellow quadrilaterals. They look a little different and I'm not really sure where to place them. Do you have any ideas or can you think of a category that they might go into? Maybe if I turn it, maybe that'll help. Look at that. Maybe if I turn my head, maybe that'll help. Turn my head a little. Let's see. No, I don't really see a category that these could go in. They look very different from what I expected. So, when I make this category of all these yellow shapes, I would call these irregular quadrilaterals, mostly because they don't necessarily have one set name. They would be in that big category of quadrilateral. It's pretty cool, right? Today, we talked about different types of quadrilaterals and how they can have qualities of multiple figures, like this rhombus here could kind of look like this parallelogram. We know that squares are very specific in their characteristics and meet the requirements to be called a rectangle, a parallelogram, and a rhombus. I wonder what other kinds of things would have groups like that. See y'all later.